Hello, everyone. My name is William Haffey. I'm a New York area-based guide, and I'm inviting you today to join me on a tour of northern Ecuador. Ecuador is a fantastically bird-rich country, and while we can't travel there because of COVID-19 this year, I invite you to spend the next hour with me looking at the fantastic birds that this country has to offer. Just a little note on this opening slide right here, this fantastic mountain, it's a volcano, behind the title of today's talk, so you can see where my cursor is Antisana Volcano. And Antisana is also the name of a national park that we're going to be visiting on this tour. It's a great place for high elevation species, and perhaps most famously, the Andean condor. All right. So just a bit of brief background information on Ecuador itself and Ecuador's avian wealth. Roughly, there are 1,800 species of birds that can be found from Ecuador's Pacific coast, which is of course at sea level, all the way up into the high Andes and down into the eastern lowlands of the Amazon. So the great diversity in habitat is what allows this country, the country of Ecuador, to be one of the most diverse in terms of its bird wealth. Many of the neotropical families that birders know and love, such as hummingbirds and tanagers and antbirds, are really, really well represented in this country. For instance, those of you that like hummingbirds, 138 species have been found within the boundaries of Ecuador. 149 species of tanagers, 92 species of antbirds, 106 species of ovenbirds and woodcreepers. The list could just go on and on. So there's no shortage of fantastic neotropical birds for the seasoned veteran bird watcher or the neophyte to the neotropics to come and enjoy. In addition to the great bird life, there's absolutely incredible scenery, whether you're in the high Andes or in the warm lowlands, either on the eastern western slopes of the Andes. The scenery is incredible. As you saw in the previous slide, the volcano Antisana is just one of many volcanoes that you can find running up and down the spine of Ecuador. And in addition to the natural beauty, there's also a good deal of cultural heritage. You can see in this image on the right, this is the main square in Quito, which is the capital city of Ecuador. And I would highly encourage everyone to spend at least a day in Quito, enjoying the beautiful architecture, the great food, and the beautiful sunny weather, at least certain times of the year. And perhaps the most appealing part of Ecuador, from the perspective of the visiting bird watcher, is that it is really well developed for receiving bird tourists. So those interested in watching birds could not pick a better country than Ecuador, because the country has lodges found throughout different altitudes, different habitats, that for many decades now have been receiving tourists from abroad and know exactly what bird watchers need and what they want to see. So couple that with an airport that's well serviced from international destinations and roads that are oftentimes very recently paved, and you have a perfect place to come visit for neotropical birds. Okay, enough on the background. Let's take a look at what Nature Travel Birding's tour looks like. The tour predictably begins and ends in the capital city of Quito, which you can see here is in the northern part of the country. And as this is an elevational map, you can see that Quito is found high in the Andes. It's the second highest capital city in the world, and it's found at about 8,500 feet or so. And throughout the course of this tour, we will be ranging from even higher than that in the high Andes to true lowland tropical rainforests at about 300 meters above sea level. Okay, so the tour does begin and end in Quito, or rather just outside Quito at the international airport in a town called Puembo. The first half of the tour, or the first third of the tour, it's perhaps best to break the tour into three separate thirds, is focused on the western slope of the Andes. The western slope can be found right here where my cursor is traveling in a circle. And this is also known as the Choco bioregion. This bioregion encompasses montane forest and also lowland forest in northwest Ecuador and adjacent southwest Colombia. This area of the world of South America is isolated from the much larger and much older Amazonian rainforest and the Amazonian basin, which is found in the eastern part of both of those countries. That isolation, as you might have guessed, provides or has provided a great deal of endemism. So there are a lot of bird species found only in the northwestern part of Ecuador and southwestern part of Colombia. And of course, those are the ones we're going to be focusing on seeing when we hit that area up on the first third of the tour. The second third of the tour, passing back through Quito to the other side of the Andes, is focused on the eastern slope of the Andes. The eastern slope is very similar, at least to the naked eye, very similar to the western slope. However, by and large, the birds that you see over there are quite different. We're even going to descend into the foothills, okay, so relatively low, almost approaching the Amazonian basin itself. And in fact, many species that are commonly found in the Amazonian basin barely sneak up to the lodge that we're going to be staying at the lowest elevation on this tour. The final third of our tour is going to be focused on the higher elevations. It's an ecosystem known as the Paramo, which is a high elevation treeless plain. It's actually very reminiscent of Scotland, very, very beautiful. And the birds found there are adapted to dealing with these really harsh climates. And you can see that sometimes snow isn't even outside the realm of possibilities. And it's my hope and the hope of everyone visiting high elevations of the Andes to see the most charismatic bird found there, the Andean condor. Just as an aside, the elevation range does cover a wide a variety of altitudes from 300 meters, which is more or less sea level, something that most people are accustomed to 3,000 meters at the highest reaches of Papayacta Pass. And yes, it is true, altitude sickness is a possibility. However, just taking it easy and acclimatizing yourself when you first arrive, which should only take a half a day or so, really does mitigate any effect of altitude. Okay, so it's really, it's not something to be concerned about, maybe be aware, but it's certainly not enough to prevent you from enjoying the bird life, even at the highest altitudes. Okay, so the first place in which we are going to stay on our trip is a wonderful bed and breakfast called Puembo Bird Garden. Puembo is a small suburb of Quito, and it is very close to the airport. So as your international flights arrive, you'll be shuttled to Puembo Bird Garden, which is a fantastically relaxing place to begin or conclude any trip. And in addition to just being beautiful and the food being fantastic and delicious there, the birds are a wonderful introduction to some of the common species of the high Andes. Now you can see in this image right here, which is of one of the gardens, and there are several, that Puembo Bird Garden has to offer. The habitat is not the high Andes, it's not the Paramo. It sort of has this very bucolic, has a very bucolic pastoral setting. And there are many feeders, both sugar water feeders for hummingbirds and seed feeders for non-hummingbirds, and even fruit feeders for that matter, for tanagers, that sort of populate the tree branches and the platforms scattered throughout the garden. So the combination of the beautiful, relaxing atmosphere, the great food, the easy access to birds, and the wonderful photography opportunities make Puembo Bird Garden the best place, in my mind, is really one of the best places from all my travels to Ecuador to begin a tour. You can see here on the left is a common flycatcher species. This is the vermilion flycatcher. Those of you from the United States perhaps are familiar with it, as it's found from the southwestern United States clear through South America. This is the male. The male of the species, it's known for its vermilion color. It's well named, and its black wings and a little black line through its eye. Very common at Puembo Bird Garden. Very, very common. This image right here shows these beautiful canary-like saffron finches, which, believe it or not, were introduced to these inter-Andean valleys, these high elevation valleys, probably due to the fact that they're just so beautiful. But they're doing very well here. They seamlessly fit in with the otherwise tropical nature of the gardens, and they're super easy to see coming to the tube feeders that the bed and breakfast maintains. So these are just some very common garden birds that you can encounter in your first 10 to 15 minutes strolling the grounds before breakfast. A slightly more, or maybe dramatically more, charismatic species is the black-tailed train bearer. So at Puembo Bird Garden, we're going to have some of our first hummingbird species of the tour, and perhaps none is more dramatic than the black-tailed train bearer. The sugar feeders that are scattered throughout the garden do a great job at attracting this really dramatic species. And as you can see, it's aptly named. The train, or the long plumes of feathers coming off the tail here, lend the bird its name. And the male, as you can see, has this really long black tail. The female, however, and the immature males, have much shorter tails, but are still dramatic. Excuse me. Are still dramatic. And these birds are pretty common. They're easy to see, and because of the presence of the sugar feeders, they're very easy to photograph as well. Okay, you could spend all morning watching these birds if it weren't for the fact that there are many other wonderful neotropical species that are worthy of our attention. At the Puembo Bird Garden, we're also going to see some of our first tanagers of the trip. Here are two images of a scrub tanager. A scrub tanager is perhaps not the most colorful tanager. Tanager families, for those of you that are not familiar with them, are really brightly colored, as you'll see as we go through this virtual tour. Scrub tanager, not so much, but it does have a sort of a subtle beauty to it. And they're very common just outside the dining area, enjoying these plantains that have been put out by the hotel. Okay, so leaving the Puembo Bird Garden behind sometime after a wonderful breakfast, we will begin to head down the western slope of the Andes. Now, I don't want to turn this into a class, but I think it's important to sort of know what we're getting ourselves into, anticipate the different altitudinal changes as we crest the high peaks of the Andes and descend into the lowlands through the middle elevation forests on the western side. Remember, this is also known as the Choco bioregion, with a high degree of endemism, birds that are found there and nowhere else. So as you pass through these different, and you can follow my cursor here on the right, as you pass through these different elevations, of course, the bird life is going to change. And we are going to spend a fair amount of time in each one of these different elevations, ticking birds that are found only in those elevations, in addition to seeing the common ones that run the gamut up and down the entire slope. So the high elevation forests, which are also known as the temperate zone, include places like Bella Vista and the upper Tandayapa Valley. Okay, these forests are characterized, as you'll see in a bit, by sort of stunted growth, lots of mist, not a lot of sun, pretty chilly actually. The temperatures are quite cool. And just below these high elevation forests are the middle elevation or subtropical forests. This includes the lower reaches of the Tandayapa Valley, Milpe, Mashpi, and Paz de las Aves, which is, as you're going to see in a few moments, just an incredible place, especially for bird photography. And we'll even spend some time in the lower elevation or the tropical zone in true, genuine lowland forest at a place called Rio Silanche. And so at any visit to the western slope of the Andes, birders definitely want to hit each of these zones because there are some really charismatic species there. But I think it's important heading into this portion of the tour to really appreciate the fact that all these differences can be accounted for over a relatively small amount of actual travel distance. This just is a perfect indication or a perfect depiction of the convenience of birding in Ecuador. Okay, so at the upper elevation zone of the Western Andes, you have Bella Vista and Tandayapa. And this picture right here perhaps is perfectly indicative of the region. It's cloudy, it's gray, all the trees are covered in moss or bromeliads or epiphytes, and the clouds are rolling in through the mountain passes. It's very, very wet. if you were here and we were here, you would feel that it's quite chilly as well. It could warm up when the sun comes out, but that doesn't happen too often, which is actually not a big deal because birding tends to be better when the sun is not showing in these cloud forests. So most of the time the birding is fantastic. Some of the birds that we encounter at these high elevation are just absolutely stunning. They really pop against the darkness of the dark greens and the grays of the habitat. Perhaps none more so than the toucan barbet. This bird is the poster child for the Choco region, at least as much as any other bird, because it is an incredibly unique type of barbet. It's somewhere between a toucan, and a barbet. The colors itself are really stunning, dramatic. The toucan barbet has a very strange call. When you go to the Bella Vista and Tandayapa valleys and you hear the toucan barbet calls ringing from mountain slope to mountain slope, it's very, very memorable. And these lovely birds, fortunately for us and fortunately for photographers, are more than happy to avail themselves to the plantain and fruit feeders that many lodges put out. And so you'll have the opportunity to get some really great pictures of this bird that is sort of the poster child, the emblematic bird of the upper reaches of the Choco region. Toucan barbets, like so many of the species that you're going to see in this virtual tour, are only found in this part of Ecuador and the adjacent parts of Colombia as well. So they're regional endemics, and and then of course, being regional endemics are a major draw for bird watchers. So Upper Tandayapa Valley, Bella Vista, toucan barbets should be everywhere. Good news for us. Perhaps the runner-up in the face of the Upper Tandayapa and Bella Vista area is the plate-billed mountain toucan. This bird is equally as charismatic, perhaps a little less confiding than the toucan barbet, but still these two pictures should be able to indicate the incredible patterns on the face and the bill of the plate-billed mountain toucan. I think it should be obvious how the bird got its name. You can see on the bill, the upper mandible, there's a bright yellow plate that lends itself to that lends just wonderful color that really does pop even in the grayness. That's obvious in both of these two pictures here. Plate-billed mountain toucans are seen on every tour. They're really a crowd pleaser, and it's quite a memorable species. In fact, so memorable that it's found its way onto the cover of the Birds of Ecuador book that I'm sure all of you are rushing off to buy right now. Plate-billed mountain toucan. Also, in the upper reaches of the Bella Vista and the Tandayapa Valley, we begin to see our first really striking and dramatic tanagers. Tanagers are most abundant at these upper and middle elevations of the Andes, and they love fruit. So many of these brightly colored birds are sort of like the tropical fish of the tropical forests. Many of these brightly colored tanagers come to feeders and allow fantastic photo opportunities. One of the most remarkable tanagers is the blue-winged mountain tanager. It is a almost electronically bright bird, and the contrast between the black parts in the wings and the mask just are stunning when they're pitted against the bright, bright day glow yellow breast and throat and back. And the blue on the wings is so diagnostic, so characteristic that it's impossible not to notice these blue-winged mountain tanagers almost from the moment you get out of the car at Bella Vista. They're specialties of the higher elevations. Unfortunately for us, they're very, very common. And you can see in this image right here, sort of the typical type of habitat that we're dealing with here. In that there are a lot of bromeliads and epiphytes and lichens that are all over these branches. It's a very weird habitat for those of you who have never visited cloud forest before, but it's one that it's very easy to quickly come to love because it is so strange and the birds are so remarkable in this unique environment. Moving on, A masked flower piercer is another member of the tanager family. Looks slightly different than the tanager we just saw in the blue-winged mountain tanager, but nonetheless, it does possess some of that bright coloration that the tanagers are so famous for. The masked flower piercers actually are very adept at raiding hummingbird feeders. So many of these lodges, of course, have hummingbird feeders to draw in the various hummingbirds found in any given area. And masked flower piercers really appreciate that free nectar as well. When they're not robbing hummingbird feeders, they're robbing native plants. And you might be able to see that at the tip of the bill here, there's a slight hook. And that little hook, that little raised hook there, allows the masked flower piercer to literally pierce the base of a flower and rob that flower of its nectar. So the flower does not have the benefit of being pollinated when the masked flower piercer avails itself to the nectar. Hummingbirds are great pollinators, as we all know, but flower piercers sort of skirt that responsibility and go right for that delicious nectar. Very common, masked flower piercers. You'll have many opportunities to photograph these guys. And there are other flower piercers too that we're going to see at other portions of on other portions of the tour. So masked flower piercer, that glowing red eye, just a really, really cool and common species. Of course, we wouldn't be complete in talking about the upper reaches of the western slope of the Andes if we didn't start to bring hummingbirds into the picture. Now, I only have 2 pictures of hummingbirds on the screen right now, but I can assure you that hummingbirds are super, super abundant at these elevations. There are many other species that you can see at Bella Vista, and you can see at the Tandayapa Valley. And even as you get into lower elevations, lower altitudes, there are more hummingbirds as well. So 2 really charismatic species are the great sapphire wing, which you can see on the left, and the buff-winged star frontlet, which you can see on the right. The names for hummingbirds are almost as dramatic as their plumage is colorful. And oftentimes they clue you in as to what the bird itself looks like. As you can see, so many of these hummingbirds love to visit sugar water feeders that the lodges put out for them. So photography opportunities are great. You can either take pictures of the hummingbirds as they sit on the feeder, or you can wait till they perch on a nearby branch to get sort of a realistic background. So buff-winged star frontlet, great sapphire wing, 2 very large hummingbirds as well. Perhaps some of you in the United States are more accustomed to the smaller ruby-throated hummingbirds or black-chinned hummingbirds. Some tropical hummingbird species are quite large. In fact, by the time we get to the end of today's tour, you'll have seen the giant hummingbird, which is the size of a large sparrow. And the great sapphire wing is also quite a large hummingbird, as you can see by this picture. Many hummingbird species, a constant swarm of them around any feeder at any time of day. Certainly very entertaining, no need for television or any sort of electronic stimulation on these tours. Moving down the western slope, we hit the middle elevation forests, and this is sort of the sweet spot on the bat for birding the western Andes. Names like Tandayapa, Milpe, Mashpi, Paz de las Aves, these are all names that are really, really familiar to birders, international birders, who enjoy the neotropics because they're synonymous, or more or less synonymous, with lots of good birds that are seen easily. And to boot, the scenery isn't bad. Look at this picture right here. I mean, it looks like Eden. It's fantastic. Sort of the rolling hills of the Andes as they tumble into the lowlands of the Pacific coast are usually clear or shrouded with mist, depending on the time of day and the time of year. But the bird activity is constant. You really are not going to be bored at any time of the day at the middle elevation of the Western Andes. Okay, so just some of the birds. And I should also add that I have listed here 4 different distinct locations that we're going to be hitting on this tour. There is some overlap because all of these are more or less at the same elevation, 500 meters or so off. And most of these birds can be found at all the different locations. And therefore, I'm just going to go through sort of the charismatic or the most noteworthy species that you can see at pretty much most of these locations. Lots of woodpeckers in Ecuador, wonderfully, and some of them are quite large and quite impressive. One of those species is the lineated woodpecker, which has quite a large range throughout most of Latin America. But they're easy to see here. And the dramatic barring on the breast and the bright red crest. And you can't see it from this image, but there's a nice a white V on the back of the lineated woodpecker. Make it a really, really impressive bird. Those of you from North America might think that this looks very similar to a pileated woodpecker, which in fact it does. It's very closely related to it. So lineated woodpeckers are among the number of species of woodpeckers you can find at these middle elevation forests. Some others are just as large as a lineated woodpecker. Others are much smaller. And we should be hitting and finding most of these species in just a few short days. Toucans as well. We already dealt with the plate-billed mountain toucan, which is found strictly at those higher elevations. As we descend into the lowlands, we begin to see some more charismatic or familiar looking toucan species. The arasaris are a type of toucan. They're typically smaller toucans that have prominent black and red portions of their plumage. So arasaris are toucans, of course. They don't perhaps look like exactly what you think of when you think of toucan Sam, but they still have the bright coloration, the charismatic bill. And they typically travel in loose, medium-sized flocks, bouncing from tree branch to tree branch. And typically, they're also quite loud as well, so they're easy to pick up. Pale-mandibuled arasaris are the only arasaris found on the western slope of the Andes, at least in this portion of the country. When we go to the eastern side, we're going to see other arasaris and toucanettes. Many toucans are possible, obviously, on this tour. Perhaps the most well-known bird of the western slope of the Andes is the Andean cock of the rock. Now, to be sure, Andean cock of the rocks are found not just in Ecuador, but Colombia and even some parts of Venezuela and Peru and Bolivia. And there's a number of different subspecies found on the eastern and western sides of the mountain. But there might be no better place to see the Andean cock of the rock than Paz de las Aves, which is a preserve that was created by some locals who realized that they could make more money showing tourists their exotic birds that live on their grounds. They can make more money doing that than farming and cutting down the forest. So it's a great place to support, and the birds there are terrific. The Andean cock of the rock blind on the grounds of Paz de las Aves is one of the best places to see these birds and a really great place to photograph them. Not to mention the breakfast there is after the early morning viewing of the cock of the rock. The breakfast there is really quite good as well. So the cock of the rock is, there's no other way to put it, an incredible looking bird. They make strange noises. They bounce around on tree branches deep in the forest at these communal leks, which are places that males come to sort of compete with each other to attract a female. And they bounce around these dark forests with these bizarre head patterns and head shapes, if you will, sort of looking like half a slice of an orange. The color is electric. The silvery gray wings on the back of their feathers, the back of their wings is dramatic. The bright yellow-orange feet. Everything about these birds is about show, and you will be entertained. They're worth the trip alone. I can't speak highly enough about the Andean cock of the rocks at Paz de las Aves. And we'll have opportunities to see these birds on the eastern side of the Andes as well. Now, perhaps the stars of the middle elevation are the tanagers. And many of these are easily viewed at Paz de las Aves as well, coming into the fruit feeders. There's just a long-held tradition of putting out plantains and bananas and papayas at many of these lodges so that the colorful tanagers and the colorful flower piercers and honey creepers and such can be lured out of the forest into close viewing quarters. And this makes it just perfect for photography. So two types of tanagers that you can expect to see are the black-chinned mountain tanager and the golden-naped tanager. Golden-naped tanager are a bit more widespread, a bit more common, easy to see. Black-chinned mountain tanagers, which are very similar to the blue-winged mountain tanagers we saw before, are quite a bit less common than most other tanagers. And at Paz de las Aves, you can see black chin mountain tanagers perhaps more easily than anywhere else in the world. They're quite tame, they come in very close, and it's just, it's an unforgettable opportunity, unforgettable moment when you get to see some of these really uncommon birds at such close quarters. So 2 types of tanagers, followed by 2 more different types of tanagers. Flame-faced tanager, no surprise how it got its name, and the black-cap tanager, which is stunning in its own right. And this is just a small sliver of the different tanagers we're going to see on this trip, both on the western and the eastern slopes. In many respects, tanagers are right up there with hummingbirds as far as being sort of the avian draw for bird watchers to the neotropics. They're very brightly colored, they're very easy to see, and they readily come to feeders, which makes them perfect subjects for photography. So flame-faced tanagers, black-cap tanagers, just a quick glance at Google will reveal the great variety of other types of tanagers that are found in Ecuador and in the neotropics at large. Another star of Paz de las Aves, and indeed the entire middle elevation of the Western Andes, are the ant pittas. Ant pittas are sort of strange looking birds, look like tennis balls with pipe cleaner legs, and they look very similar to the pittas of Africa and Asia that some old world birders might be more familiar with. But these ant pittas typically are very drab, which is perfect for their typical habitat in the forest floor, deep in the dark rainforests. And at Paz de las Aves, there are 5 different types of ant pittas that are easily drawn out of the forest using worms. So as Paz de las Aves has continued in operation for 15, almost 20 years at this point, men have been feeding the ant pittas in the forest little chopped up bits of earthworm. Now these birds are totally wild, and it just began a sort of an experiment to see if there could be sort of if the proprietors would be able to lure these really difficult to see birds out of the forest. And sure enough, all of these different species do respond to it. 3 of the most charismatic types of ant pittas, the ones that are perhaps the most showy and interesting to look at, are the mustached ant pitta, the chestnut-crowned ant pitta, and the yellow-breasted ant pitta. Subtly, they're all very beautiful, and their personality and their inquisitiveness make them a favorite on every tour. No one's going to say, I'm sick of seeing ant pittas, because they're so difficult to see. When you get to see them, they're such a treat. And we're going to see a number of other ant pittas on the tour. We oftentimes see ant pittas away from these quote unquote feeding stations, and they're equally as impressive. There is even a species of ant pitta that's found very, very high up in the Paramo, so the high elevation plains that are super confiding. They're almost like robins or thrushes, in that they're bouncing along the trails right in front of you. So ant pittas are always a treat to see, and there's no better place to see them than the middle elevations of the Western Andes. Of course, we got to give the respect to the hummingbirds. The hummingbirds are the stars of the show here, if the tanagers will allow it. 3 species of hummingbirds that you can encounter with relative ease at this elevation are the rufous-tailed hummingbird, which is found throughout parts of Central America as well, and northern South America, the booted racquet-tail, and the velvet purple coronet. Now, the booted racquet-tail is just in a league of its own. It's an incredible looking bird. It has these tennis racket-like tail feathers that come out and end in sort of these paddles, as you can sort of see in the top right-hand image. But the first part of its name comes from the fact that it has these sort of fluffy white slippers. These slippers are white on the western side of the Andes. When we go to the eastern slope of the Andes, the booted racquet-tail is going to have brown slippers. Same species, 2 different subspecies, just slight differences. Doesn't change the fact that they're both wonderfully dramatic. Everyone loves them. They almost look like seahorses flying through the air with their long tail. They're so graceful. They're absolutely terrific. I love seeing booted racquet-tails. And the velvet purple coronet, does anyone really need to say anything more than it's a iridescently purple hummingbird? It's a crowd pleaser, one of everyone's favorite hummingbirds. It's really range restricted, which means that it's very difficult to see this bird away from a few select locations in Ecuador. It is found somewhat in Colombia, but the easiest places to see them are the middle elevation of the Western Andes. And they come to feeders at several of the locations that we're going to be visiting. Just a really, really great hummingbird. And when that limited light deep in the forest hits the iridescent feathers and the coronet lights up bright purple, there are a few more memorable moments on this tour than that. Heading down to the low elevation of the western slope, if it could still be called the slope of the Andes, we visit Rio Silanche, which is a small preserve, relatively small preserve, that's nestled in the midst of oil palm plantations. So not surprisingly, low elevation forests in the western part of the Andes have been really heavily cut. And there's not a lot of primary uncut forest remaining. This is one such slice, and the birds predictably are terrific. There are some species here that are just not found anywhere else on the tour. They're only found in the Choco region. And Rio Salanche, fortunately, has a canopy tower, which we're able to climb to the very top of, scan the canopy, and wait and hope for a large flock, mixed flock of species coming through. And when that does happen, it's probably the most exciting hour in birding. The number of different species, from tanagers to wood creepers to antbirds to toucans that come through are truly memorable. So we spend a lot of time birding inside the forest itself, which you can see a picture of on the right-hand side. And on the left-hand side is one of the more exposed, for lack of a better word, logging trails that, that go just to the outside of the preserve, which still provide some really, really solid birding. A Choco endemic is the Choco toucan. These are very, very similar to the chestnut mandibled toucan that are found in the same area. These two species look virtually identical. They're slightly different in size. Very tough to tell in the field, however. They have a distinct call, which is the best way to identify them as a Choco toucan. And both Choco toucans and chestnut mandibled toucans are found at these lower elevations, easily seen from the car park, easily seen from the tower, even walking the logging trails and the farming trails just to the outside of the preserve usually yields these roving troops of toucans as they bounce from tree to tree. Very charismatic, very easy to spot. Absolutely, I mean, toucans, who doesn't like a toucan? Tanagers, not surprisingly, are also at these lower elevations, though not in the same abundance, or I should say the same diversity, as you see at the middle and upper elevations. One tanager that's found primarily at the lower elevations is the blue-necked tanager that you can see perched here. This photograph was taken from the tower itself, which you can see is a great vehicle for getting right in at the bird's eye level. So many different tanagers. Some are only, as I said, only found in the Choco region, and they oftentimes these ones, though the diversity isn't there, the color and the patterns are just, they're stunning. So blue-necked tanager is one of the ones we should absolutely expect to see, even on a slow day at Rio Silanche. Now, after we finish with the lowlands of Ecuador, the lowlands on the western slope, I should say, we're coming all the way back across the Interandean Valley through Quito and start to head down the eastern slope of the Andes. Now, the way in which we do the eastern slope of the Andes is a little bit different. Rather than starting at the high elevation and working down to the low elevation, what we like to do is drive entirely or directly to the lower elevation lodge, which is called Wild Sumaco Lodge, start there and then work our way back up to the temperate zone, and then finally conclude by going to the Paramo at Antisana National Park before the conclusion of the tour. So we wind up back where we need to be at the conclusion. I should also add that typically as we pass from the western side of the Andes to the eastern side of the Andes, we do stop at some high elevation areas, but I'm not going to address them at this point in the tour. I'm going to save that for when we do higher elevation stuff at the end of this virtual tour. But just be aware that we're not going to ignore great birding locations, and there are several as you go from the western side to the eastern side. One of which is the famous Papayacta Pass. So the eastern slope of the Andes can, just like the west, be broken down into 3 different elevational zones: the temperate, the subtropical, and the edge of the tropical zone. The low elevation in the eastern slope is not quite as low as we go on the west, but still you get some Amazonian species, Amazonian lowland species that come up just to Wild Sumaco Lodge. And you can see this image on the right here is, it's a lookout, it's a mira, what you say in Spanish, a mirador or a vista, that's looking towards the Amazonian lowlands down here on the way down to Wild Sumaco Lodge. So sort of the dramatic up and down steep slopes of the higher Andes are leveling out, and we're beginning to see the classic tropical clouds, the heavy condensation of the lowlands. And of course, that means incredible, incredible birds. So let's begin at the low elevation lodge, which is Wild Sumaco. Wild Sumaco is one of, and having spent a good deal of time in Latin America in a number of many different countries, many different lodges, I can say that Wild Sumaco is one of the most incredible birding lodges that I've ever been to. I cannot speak highly enough of it. It's named for the Sumaco volcano, which is sort of like an outline volcano of the Andes. It's separate from the main chain, the main spine, and it's a dramatic cone that you can see from this deck. And this deck in the image here on the right is of Wild Sumaco, and it just looks clear across this little depression. You can almost call it a valley right at the Sumaco volcano. Great place to spend your afternoons. There are hummingbird feeders on either end that are some of the best in the neotropics anywhere. The chairs, of course, are very relaxing. There's always coffee, wine, beer, creature comforts are all there for you. And there's always something good, whether it's macaws flying across in front of you, or ant pittas or ant thrushes walking just under the front part of that balcony there. Wild Sumaco is constant in its delivery of good birds. The image on the left just shows the residencies or the rooms that are just apart from the main lodge. Everything's very well lit. It's very safe, but this is a remote lodge. There is electricity, of course, but there is no Wi-Fi. There is no cell service. So you're really off the grid. At Wild Sumaco, you're there for the birds and the wildlife, and it is great. I can't speak more highly of that lodge. So I just mentioned that the hummingbird feeders there are some of the best in the world, I think we can say. Here are 5 of the common species that you should encounter, probably certainly within the first day, if not the first hour, at Wild Sumaco. So starting on the left, you have the Napo saberwing, which is, Napo is the name of the province in which the lodge is located. Large hummingbird, dramatic in its blues, its purples, and its greens. Gould's jewel front, the bottom left. Spectacular, really uncommon hummingbird, not endemic to the region, but wherever it's found, it's never common. And this lodge is perhaps the best place in the world to see a Gould's jewel front. The wire-crested thorntail, which is one of the most memorable hummingbirds you're going to see, with its stark crest. It has this sort of white out painted saddle on its back and this very sharp, almost raggedy looking tail, and an incredible display, an incredible mating display that the male does to attract the attention of a female. Wire-crested thorntails are always a big hit. Golden-tailed sapphire, which looks like it is actually electrified. And the gradation of the blue head to the green body to the orange and brick red tail is something that you'll never forget. And they're common birds too. Golden-tailed sapphires are easily seen. They're always at the feeders. They might even be the most common hummingbird species at most of the feeders at Wild Sumaco. So the common garden birds here are things that will stop you dead in your tracks. And here's another picture of a booted racket tail. Notice this one is of the eastern slope. It has that It's a little more difficult to see here, but the little brown slippers. Um, and that's the primary difference between the two different subspecies, the western and the eastern slope booted racket tails. Hummingbirds are everywhere. There are always, or not always, but there are regularly rarities. They have hummingbird feeders placed deep in the forest. It's a really, really good setup if you like hummingbirds. And the photo opportunities, it goes without saying, are second to none. Some of the best birds can be found right from that porch, though the trails at Wild Sumaco are incredible. They just crisscross the entire property, typically going through mature forest or old secondary forest. But this photograph of a deep blue flower piercer was taken right from that veranda that I had on the screen a few slides ago. Stunning bird. Even if you're sitting inside the dining hall having your lunch, the likelihood of something really interesting showing up just outside the windows is really likely. So it's always important to have your camera and your binoculars on you at all times, because you never know what's going to show up. This flower piercer, much like the masked flower piercer that we saw on the western slope, does the same exact thing to flowers. It pierces the base of the flowers and steals its nectar. And I mean, just look at the eye. The eye on that bird is gorgeous. And this is par for the course. So many birds that you see at Wild Sumaco from the veranda are like this, whether it's tanagers or honey creepers. It seems like something colorful and tropical and exotic looking always is showing up. Wild Sumaco, like many of these lodges, does have what we call a feeding station, where little chopped up bits of worms are fed to attract ant pittas and sometimes other species as well, such as this white-crowned tapaculo. And tapaculos, for those of you that know neotropical birds, are typically really, really hard to spot. Obviously, they're not very brightly patterned. They typically live in thick undergrowth. They're very loud, so they're easy to hear, but it's not common, or it's not easy, I should say, to draw them into the open. It can take a very long time to get a good view of a tapaculo. But this white-crowned tapaculo at Wild Sumaco has no problem hopping out on a branch or a rock to eat these chopped up worms, and consequently allows for great photo opportunities. There are also ant pittas that come to this, and nightingale thrushes. So one morning is usually spent, at least for an hour or so, or afternoon. There's an afternoon feeding time. It's almost like SeaWorld in that respect. One morning or afternoon, we typically spend looking at these birds and getting some great photographs. One family we haven't looked at yet on this tour, but is found both on the western and the eastern slopes, are the trogons. Trogons are found throughout the tropics across the world. And this individual right here is the Amazonian white-tailed trogon. Trogon taxonomy is sort of up in the air, so it's important that we stay abreast of what the new taxonomic breakdowns are, what species have been split, which species have been lumped together. Those splitting seems to be a bit more common at this point in time. This one's the Amazonian white-tailed trogon. You can see how it gets its name, has these white feathers on the underside of its tail. The male is obviously more colorful than the female, or I guess it's not obvious, but if you were to see the female, it would be quite obvious. Strongly sexually dimorphic, as are most trogons. And this bird was found right along the roadside leading up to the lodge. Oftentimes, the best and the easiest birding in many neotropical locations is from the roadside, not necessarily because the habitat's the best, it's just easiest to see most of the birds, as they're unobscured by vegetation. So this Amazonian white-tailed trogon was very confiding. We ran into a number of them. We also heard them almost continually throughout the day. Now, I have a quick video that I'd like to share with you here, because at Nature Travel Birding, we do like to pay particular attention to the mammals that we see on our trip as well. And Wild Sumaco might be most famous for, at least in the mammal department, for its tamarin monkeys. These are Napo tamarins. And I play this video here for you. You can see these little monkeys enjoying some fallen plantains. All right, as you can see, those little guys were really enjoying the food that was put out for them. Super common at the lodge. You'll get your pictures of these monkeys and potentially some other monkeys as well. The mammals on the trip are certainly not as as large or dramatic as maybe an African or an Indian tour might be. But we do have the opportunity to see spectacled bears in the highlands, and in the lower elevations, there are typically monkeys and a few species of deer that are possible. I wouldn't bank on seeing a jaguar. If that were to happen. I'd be utterly shocked. But there are smaller cats that are possible in seeing. So we do get some interesting mammal species as well. Moving up the slope from one great lodge to another, Cabaña San Isidro and Guacamayos Ridge, which is not a lodge, but it's in the vicinity of Cabaña San Isidro. The Cabaña San Isidro is the iconic lodge of the eastern slope. It's been around for a number of years, number of decades now, and it is situationally perfect for exploring this middle elevation sort of cloud forest, montane forest region, and the great birds that it has to offer. So this is heading back up the slope, at least 1,000 meters above Wild Sumaco Lodge. You can see this image here on the left is from the balcony that's depicted on the right. And it shows that much of the forest in this area is very similar to the western slope of the Andes. Lots of epiphytes, not too sunny, rains pretty regularly, hence the need for this covered balcony over the covered roof over the balcony. And we don't let that we don't let that rain impact our birding, because the birds don't seem to mind. Guacamayos Ridge, incidentally, Guacamayos means macaw, but Guacamayos Ridge is not too far from Cabaña San Isidro, and it's a ridge sort of extending out from the Andes that provides slight difference in elevation. And of course, because there's a difference in elevation, there's slight differences in the birds. So we spend some time, depending on where recent good sightings have been recorded from, we spend a fair amount of time at both locations. And Cabaña San Isidro is not only known for its birds and its comfortable rooms, but the food there is, I can say, the best out of all the lodges that we're staying at. I think you could stay there for 2 whole weeks and not eat the same meal twice. There's a great deal of emphasis placed on the quality and the inventiveness of the meals there. So it's always great to spend a day out in the misty and sometimes chilly cloud forest and come back to a wonderful, like a truly wonderful meal. Cannot say enough about these lodges. The hummingbird feeders at Cabaña San Isidro are incredible, just like Wild Sumaco. Take a look at this video. You'll see the diversity. You'll see some bronzy incas. You'll see some chestnut-breasted coronets, some other species of hummingbirds mobbing this hummingbird feeder that is hanging off that covered balcony that you saw on the previous slide. So just enjoy the diversity and the abundance of some of these species in this video. As you can see, not only are there lots of hummingbirds, but there's lots of rain at Cabaña San Isidro. So the good news is when it does rain, there are enough hummingbirds to keep you entertained for the sake of photography, And the number of species there is really, really great. Typically in a day, or I should say in an hour even, it's not unusual to have 7 to 10 different species show up. Perhaps the most dramatic of all species is the long-tailed sylph, which is a hummingbird not unlike the black-tailed train bearer that we saw at the very beginning of this virtual tour, but rather than being relatively brownish green body with a black tail, it's a brilliant green body with an electric blue tail. And unfortunately, I don't have an image of that, but they're common enough that they will, they can be all but guaranteed on this tour. Another hummingbird species that was not seen in that last video is the collared Inca, dramatic black and white hummingbird species. It's not often you hear of hummingbirds being black and white, but the collared Inca is an aggressive hummingbird, and when it shows up at the feeder, it certainly takes control. You can see that there is some iridescence on the crown of this individual. This is a male, and it has a sort of a violet iridescence up there. And again, they come to feeders that are within just several feet of the observer. So photography opportunities, those of you that love photography are going to love these lodges, especially around mealtime. Feel free to get up and wander around, take photographs of hummingbirds. If you're not satisfied with the shots you got in the first hour, the good news is not much will change besides the lighting for the second hour. So the opportunities there are really limitless. San Isidro, at least in the birding, the neotropical birding community, is perhaps best known for its San Isidro mystery owl. This owl is probably a variety or a subspecies or perhaps a localized population of a black banded owl. But because it shares some, or because it has some unusual plumage characteristics, it's still known as the mystery owl. And it's really easy to spot the mystery owl in the car park of the lodge. Typically after dinner, after the sun has set, with the help of a local guide, we'll go out and look for these birds as they sit very near the street lights just outside the lodge looking for insects and rodents to eat. I apologize for the quality of the images, but it was pitch black as it is quite remote. And I believe on that evening there was a storm that put out the light that these typically hunt by. So they're very cool, very subtly patterned yet beautiful owl species. The eyes obviously glow bright red, ruby colored. And it's sort of a novelty species. Black-banded owls can be found throughout the eastern slope of the Andes. But the fact that this particular variant is found on the grounds of the San Isidro Lodge makes it a bit of a local celebrity. So we'll definitely spend the time after dinner to find these birds. And a number of other owl species. There are plenty of owl species that can be heard calling. If you just walk down the access road to the cabins, you can hear a number of different owl species calling soon after the sun sets. More trogons. Golden-headed quetzal is one of the most beautiful trogons we're going to see on this trip, specialty of the mid-elevation forests. We also will probably see these on the western side of the Andes as well. But you can see the male on the left and the female on the right. Classic trogon coloration in the sense that there's this bright red or sometimes yellow breast and a green or sometimes purple dorsal side. The male is a stunning bird. It calls incessantly throughout the day, very loud. So it's typically easy to tick that box, the herd only box. To see them can be a bit more challenging. Depends on the day. Sometimes we're very lucky. We'll see a dozen of them. Sometimes we'll just hear them. But they're relatively common. They're absolutely stunning birds. They don't have the tail of the resplendent quetzal that you might see in Panama or in Guatemala or Costa Rica, but they really shine, especially in the darkness of the cloud forest. And they do have a habit of perching sort of for long periods of time on relatively exposed branches. So photography opportunities here are really great as well. Golden-headed quetzals are one of two different species of quetzals that we can see on this trip, the crested quetzal being the other, but golden-headed are definitely the more common of the two. We haven't spent much time talking about furnarids, so wood creepers and ovenbirds, but they're a very large family of neotropical birds. Typically, they're brown, heavily patterned, and somewhat secretive in their behavior. But wood creepers have sort of a cult following among neotropical birders just because of their interesting behavior. They climb up trees just like woodpeckers, but they have these oftentimes dramatically downcurved bills and the subtly beautiful pattern on their undersides. This is a montane wood creeper, very common at this altitude. I do apologize, the photo could be a bit better, but they move pretty quickly, and when they see people, just like woodpeckers, they decide to switch to the back side of the tree branch. So the photography is a bit opportunistic, but I can guarantee that we will see all different types of wood creepers, from smaller ones to all the way up to the largest species. Typically, we see a good number of wood creepers on these tours. This is a montane wood creeper. Now, the high elevation forests are as dramatic as any that we've seen on this trip. And our base for exploring these higher elevation forests, which we also call temperate forests just because of the temperature, it's a cooler forest. Our base for this is Guango Lodge. Now, Guango Lodge is operated by the same family that operates Cabañas San Isidro, which means, good for us, the food is just as good, the service is just as good. It's a great experience. I've been to Guango Lodge a number of different times now, and it is one of the coolest, cutest, like coziest places you could stay in the neotropics. It's unlike any other place. It has almost this Tudor style construction to it. The main dining room has a number of fireplaces. As you can see, the stone and the tile work is great. Not to dwell on the architecture too much, but it's really a great place to stay. I can't speak highly enough of both Guango and Cabañas San Isidro. If it's not obvious at this point, the places we stay at on this tour are top notch. It pays that Ecuador has been in the avatourism business for a long time now, because these lodges really are getting it right. So Guango Lodge is found surprisingly about an hour from the international airport, yet the habitat here is distinctly wet forest, high elevation forest, and of the eastern slope. Guango Lodge is known for its hummingbird feeders, some characteristic and charismatic species that we'll see in just a moment. Known for its and it's known for its close proximity to the Papayacta River, which is a raging river. Well, it depends really more or less on the high altitude rains, but a whitewater river home to white-capped dippers and torrent terannulets, and perhaps most notably, one of everyone's favorite bird species, the torrent duck. So this is a short video of the Papayacta River, and you will see both a male and female torrent duck. The female is sort of a russet color. The male is bright white with sort of a black pattern with a bright orange bill. Really striking looking. And just a note on the forest, the altitude here is so high and the temperature really is so cool that much of the forest, especially the forest you're going to see on the opposite side of the river here, is alder forest. So those of you that are from northern latitudes are familiar with these types of trees. Not a tropical tree, yet they make up these high elevation temperate forests. So it's a really eerie feeling to walk through these forests, and at least for someone from the United States, my word, this kind of feels a little bit like walking through Maine in certain respects. But when you see a mountain toucan around the bend in the trail, you know for a fact you are still at the equator. So here's a video on the Papayacta River just outside Guango Lodge. All right, I do apologize a little bit for the camera and also for Zoom not really cooperating with streaming some of these videos, but I think you get the picture. High Andean River, lots of white water, and these torrent ducks like to hang out in the torrents themselves. And there's nothing more entertaining than watching these ducks fight the current, going up and down the river, and then popping out like a buoy onto some of these rocks where they are very easy to see and photograph. I've been to Guango, I'm not sure how many times, and I have never failed to see a torrent duck. So those of you that really want to see one, I can all but guarantee it. Another species that is all but guaranteeable at Guango Lodge is the sword-billed hummingbird. I don't think I need to explain why it's called the sword-billed hummingbird. And while it doesn't really have a dramatic gorget, which is the throat area of the hummingbird, and it doesn't really have incredibly bright coloration, the bill itself makes it easily one of the top 3 most remarkable hummingbirds that we see on this trip. Just to watch it try to feed at the feeders is kind of amusing, as it's sort of positioned so far away just to make sure that bill can fit into one of the feeder ports. Much more naturally speaking, it's cooler to see the sword-billed hummingbird feed on the trumpet flowers that grow right next to the lodge. So in the morning, you could sit out there with your coffee, and there's these trumpet flowers that hang down, and you see the sword-billed hummingbird go right up in there and get nectar. And you could obviously see this coevolution between the flower and its pollinator, the sword-billed hummingbird. The sword-billed hummingbird is always sort of known the world over because its bill is it measures longer than its body. So it's one of the few bird, I think it's the only bird actually, that can lay claim to that. Sword-billed hummingbird is not soon forgotten. More trogons. The masked trogon is perhaps the most common trogon of the higher elevations. Classic trogon pattern again. This is a male. Sits still for long amounts of time. Makes it very easy to photograph. And they're very common at Guango Lodge. I find a lot of bird species at Guango Lodge are just very common and easy to see. I mean, obviously you have to deal with the mixed flocks that are so characteristic of tropical areas, and sometimes there is a lull in the bird activity. But most of the time, it's very easy to see our target species at Guango. And so I've had some great birding mornings and afternoons walking the trails there where you have this mixed species flock come in of these super high elevation birds, different types of mountain tanagers, different types of wood creepers and fernarids, so ovenbirds, and warblers come through that you really only find at this narrow altitudinal range. Don't get a lot of attention because they're not sort of the charismatic lower elevation species, but are like little gems in the forest. And those are some of the best mornings and afternoons that we have on the trip. In this sort of dramatic, misty landscape. You won't soon forget it. All right, so we're going to conclude this e-tour at the highest elevation of the trip, and that is at Papayacta Pass in Antisana National Park. There are some differences between Papayacta Pass and Antisana National Park, but generally speaking, they're both high elevation ecosystems. Papayacta Pass is the pass through which you have to drive to go from Quito and Puembo in the central Andean Valley to the eastern slope of the Andes. And you're really above the tree line at some points. It looks like something you wouldn't expect on the equator. The birds there can be great. You could even see Andean condors soaring overhead, and the road is terrific, and it's so dramatic. I can't really describe how dramatic it is to you, but when you're on it, you'll say, my gosh, this is some of the most incredible scenery I've ever seen. So Papayacta Pass has some great birds as well. There's rufous-bellied seed snipes that you can see high up off the main highway at a radio tower there. We spend a lot of time working the wet paramo, as it's known, looking for the seed snipe and other species that love that wet paramo. And we also will visit Antisana, which you can see on the left and on the right, for more dry paramo and at Antisana National Park, there is a big lake as well, so many high elevation water birds can be found, including a gull species, which is perhaps not a type of bird you'd expect to add to your trip list if you're going to the Andes, far from any coast. Just a word on the picture on the right. This is a canyon leading into Antisana, and this is an easy place. It's known as Antisania. This is an easy place to see the Andean condors. Of course, they're not common, but typically if you spend enough time overlooking this canyon right here, you'll see condors flying in down the slot of the canyon, sometimes perching on the far wall. One of the most memorable birding experiences that anyone can have for sure, seeing these giant raptors just cruising the skies in the Andes. Now, I showed this more for the dramatic effect, but Papallacta's weather can be tricky. I've driven through the pass a number of times and seen snowmen built on the side of the road, and the weather can turn just like that. Fortunately, it's close enough to Guango Lodge and other good birding sites that if the weather does go foul, and as soon as the novelty of snow in the tropics wears off, we have other places we can go and then return when the weather clears. But here's an image of being caught in a snowstorm unexpectedly in Papallacta Pass. You could hear a tawny ant pitta calling in the background, which, given the wind and the chill, I did not spend much time looking for at that time. But the scenery is incredible, absolutely incredible. One species of hummingbird that we're going to be looking for at these higher elevations is the giant hummingbird. Not typically found at the high elevations in Papallacta. This is more commonly seen at the access road to Antisana National Park. In fact, there's a little restaurant there that has a hummingbird feeder that attracts giant hummingbirds regularly. And they're typically found feeding on flowering agaves and yucca alongside the roads. Not terribly difficult to see, but absolutely worth the time and the effort because of their incredibly large size and slow wing beat. More than makes up for their sort of drab coloration. Giant hummingbirds are also, as the name indicates, the largest hummingbirds, so that's a fine proverbial feather in one's cap in the neotropical bird department. Antisana National Park is ornithologically strange in a number of respects. One is you probably would not expect to see ibis, a bird we often more associate with lowlands aquatic environments, sort of walking through these high elevation grasslands as you might expect cows or goats to do. But black-faced ibis, and this is the population at Antisana National Park of the northernmost, is the northernmost population of the species. They're not common, but they're typically seen pretty easily and even from the roadside as you're driving into the national park. So black-faced ibis wander through these high fields in loose flocks. Stunning bird, kind of quietly one of the more beautiful birds that we see in these high elevations. And they enjoy feeding on arthropods and small reptiles that can be found, and amphibians that can be found in these bogs that sort of dot the highlands up here. It looks very much like Scotland. For those of you that have ever been to Scotland, haven't found any Scotch distilleries up there, but the scenery comes pretty close. There are lots of small brown birds that upon closer inspection have stunning plumage patterns, such as this many-striped canistero. Canistero just means an individual or something or someone that makes a basket. And these birds, predictably, given its name, create nests that somewhat resemble baskets. And these canisteros are pretty common. They're found in the grasslands, sort of scurrying around like little mice, just staying out of view. It's a bit of a game of hide and seek to get a photograph of them, but it's well worth the effort. There are a number of different similar types of species to the many-striped canistero. And there are also, as I've said, tawny ant pittas up here. Lots of small things, not the most colorful, but have sort of a unique enough place in this tour to warrant a spot near the top of the interest level list. This bird, however, would do well anywhere in the popularity department. The Ecuadorian hill star is one of the most emblematic birds of the high Andes. It's nearly, very, very nearly endemic to the country of Ecuador. If a few of them weren't found in southern Colombia, Ecuador could claim it as its own. And typically, the Ecuadorian hill star is found perched on the outermost branch of a small shrub. They enjoy feeding on these churiquiragua flowers, which are sort of little orange bottle brush-like flowers. Um, and the Ecuadorian hill star, that is very well adapted to the harsh, snowy, cold, very windy climate that is found in Antisana. The males, and this is a male right here, are super dramatic in their coloration. They're beautiful. This electric blue head and the bright white and the green back, which you cannot see, unfortunately, in this image, are just sort of, they're like fireworks in this otherwise gray and dreary environment. I'll never forget observing an Ecuadorian hill star feeding on insects on the edge of a pond in the high Andes. And it's just one of those things that sticks with you forever because they're incredibly well adapted to their environment, yet they do it in style. Ecuadorian hill stars, typically, if you were to ask any tour participant what are the top 10 birds that you see, that you saw on your Ecuadorian trip, Ecuadorian hill stars usually factor into the top 10 of many people. This bird, surprisingly, perhaps surprisingly, is a type of raptor. It's called the carunculated caracara. It's a fun name to say. It's in the falcon family, and these birds are so common, and you find them in sort of an uncharacteristic way, wandering the open plains of Antisana, much like gazelles or zebras would do in Africa. They're very common. They allow pretty close approach and great photo opportunities. So the carunculated caracara are one of the most common birds you can see in Antisana, but being common does not mean you have to be ugly. And especially as far as raptors go, this bird is quite beautiful and quite confiding, as I've said. Okay, so that concludes our tour of northern Ecuador, both the western and the eastern slope of the Andes and the high elevation Paramo in Antisana and Papayacta. It's my hope that you could join me next year in July for our trip to Ecuador and see many of these birds, hopefully all of these birds, in addition to hundreds of other ones. It's a great 2-week trip. It's a great country to visit. It's something that should be on the bucket list of every birder. It should be actually higher than the bucket list because it's just the perfect place to spend some time getting to know neotropical birds or revisiting old friends if you've been to the neotropics before. So it's been my pleasure to host this virtual tour, and it's my hope to see you all soon.